Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Rosen Wartell, honored to be the president of the Urban Institute and to welcome you here with us late this afternoon on the eve of a eagerly anticipated day. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Rapson, president and CEO of the Kresge Foundation, Fernando Rejón, executive director of the Urban Peace Institute, and my wonderful urban colleague, senior policy fellow Jessie Jannetta, to talk about how the federal government can support community-driven public safety efforts. Today's event is part of a series of evidence for action discussions we're holding with leading changemakers and our policy analysts on questions emerging from the COVID crisis and the long overdue reckoning with our nation's ongoing structural racism. I'm really grateful that you're here late in the day on this special day, but for a highly relevant topic. We're going to talk about how the federal government can be part of helping to change the experience in America's communities. But first, let me provide a couple of housekeeping notes. This event is being recorded, and the recording and the relevant links will be posted online afterwards. All of you are muted, but we want to hear from you. So type your questions or comments in the question box at any time. These are short and sweet events. We don't have a lot of time, but even if we can't get to them all, it's really helpful for us and the panelists to hear what you're thinking about. So we shape what we do in the future, and we will try to weave some of your comments into the conversation. And join us also in the social media world by using Twitter, #live@urban. Today's conversation is also part of the Opportunity for All project, which is based on a simple premise. Every family should live in a neighborhood that supports their well-being and their children's ability to thrive. We're talking about what happens in communities, but that doesn't mean there's no federal role. In this project, we ask, how might the federal government support this place-based vision? Today, too many families, particularly families of color, live in neighborhoods that have suffered from decades of disinvestment, have been displaced from neighborhoods that are revitalizing, or are excluded from neighborhoods where opportunity-enhancing amenities are plentiful. Generations of policies and practices, from redlining, disinvestment, predatory lending, and intensive and sometimes brutal police, and more, have created segregation and concentrated property in many places, limiting the possibility of shared prosperity for many of our Black, Latinx, and Native American communities. In many of these neighborhoods, the residents live with violence sometimes perpetrated from within the community and sometimes from without, including by police. Public safety is not their experience, but it is very much the goal of many residents, we understand from the work here at the Urban Institute. But if you ask community residents and local experts what they would do to create safe and fair communities, few would focus solely on more policing, prosecution, and incarceration. As the nation has been finally compelled to recognize this summer, their experience is far too often that policing itself can cause harm, even death, particularly for Black people in our communities. In fact, the policies and strategies that governments might advance in the name of public safety sometimes have little to do with how communities define and understand their own safety. So what's another way? Communities around the country, like LA, and we'll hear about this afternoon, have experimented with community-driven strategies, born of the local expertise of residents for what would make their communities safer. Today, on the eve of an election, we'll talk about how the federal government could provide supports that, especially at a time of state and local budget cuts, would help all neighborhoods become places of opportunity and inclusion, and in particular, support community-driven public safety efforts. So I'd like to begin this discussion by welcoming my good friend, Rip Rapson, president of the Kresge Foundation. And while he's coming aboard, hey, Rip, I want to say thank you to Kresge for supporting the Opportunity for All project. Rip and I have worked together now for almost a decade because when I first took this job, people pointed me to him to say, that's the person you ought to talk to about expertise on how to make things work in communities, not with experts and foundations and people from Washington coming from afar to tell people how to fix it, but how to find the insight and expertise of leaders who are already in those communities to find their own solutions. So that's really what the Opportunity for All program is about. How do we support from the federal government, those kinds of efforts. And so really great to be with you here today, Rep. The Opportunity for All project and much of your work in Michigan and around the country is predicated on this idea that better practices and policies can help reverse place-based disparities, and that doing so will support fairer, more just access to opportunity. So place has been really at the center of your framework for change for at least as long as I've known you at Kresge. Can you talk to us a little bit about sort of what motivates you to focus on place, and also particularly on strategies that are born of the places where you work?
No, thank you, Sarah. It's a pleasure to join. In many ways, you've sort of set the table exactly right. Place ultimately is where all of the complexity of urban life can get interwoven and managed. It all just sort of touches in place. It kind of ricochets across, one system to another, and it's the really only scale of manageability that works when you think about it. Place is probably also where lines of accountability can be drawn and held. You know who's in charge, you know who's not in charge, you know who's moving in which direction and where they need to be turned just a hair. Place is where the building of inclusive local economies becomes your responsibility, not the responsibility of a county or a state or even the federal government. And, particularly given the unrest of these last many months, place is where the effects of racial justice are most clearly and acutely felt, and where you can clearly identify pathways to a sort of a more just and robust community. And so, simply stated, I think place is where the problems are most clearly presented and where you can actually have the ability to deliver results in a way that makes sense for those who live there.
So we'll talk in a few minutes with our friends about community safety, but I think the approach that they are offering here in this federal policy proposal that they're offering up is one that shares a lot with some of the work that Kresge has done and that we've partnered with you on, particularly your work in the city of Detroit, where you were a critical part of putting together a strategy for the recovery of that city at a very troubled time. And the work we've done together on something called the Shared Prosperity Partnership, which is very much about supporting local born solutions. So can you talk a little bit about those experiences and this term you use sometimes, ecologies of capacity, that how do the federal government, philanthropy support these local places?
I think if we learn anything from sort of the decade of struggle that Detroit had, it was that there are lots of on-ramps for the federal government to be helpful in community. I think we tend to think that the federal government is going to enter through City Hall, and obviously that's a huge part of it. There are all sorts of ways in which the capacity of City Hall needs to be buttressed by federal policy, federal practice, federal expertise, and so much else. But it's not just City Hall. And I think what happened during Detroit's recovery was that the feds figured out that they could work with a more distributive sort of leadership capacity in a place like Detroit, that there were lots of ways in which this ecology of capacity was manifested in community development finance institutions and community development organizations and block clubs, in philanthropy, in private sector actors. And so the single thing I think the federal government, particularly the Obama administration, did with Detroit's recovery was to fortify that ecology. It figured out ways to sort of customize, right size, and right scope the kind of supports that the federal government uniquely has at its disposal. Sean Donovan, for example, created in Detroit the SC2 program, in which he identified key administration department figures and then tasked them into local community. In some cases, it was the Justice Department. In other cases, it was from HUD. In other cases, it was from Commerce. And they were able to work with sort of the different parts of the ecology of the place to figure out what ways the federal government could be most helpful.
So talk for a minute about the role of community organizations and leaders at the grassroots level. We've talked about in other settings that some places have very strong local capacity. Other places it's less strong. Some of it is the capacity of those organizations is heavily dependent on resources that come from local government. We're about to face a period of likely state and local government funding cuts because their resources have been constrained due to the pandemic. Again, this talk, eventually we're going to come back to what's the federal role, but first, why is it so important that the leadership of efforts, whether it's in public safety or economic development, come from within community? And what role can there be to help build that capacity of local leaders?
It's such a complex proposition, Sarah, because cities are so very different. And so just to state the obvious, you sort of begin with the context, and there needs to be some ability to table set. You know, where are we as a community? What are our capacities? Where do you need to build something new? Where do you need to fortify something in existence? Where do you need to accelerate already good work? And what's so interesting about the Detroit experience, which I think in many ways is mirrored in other communities across the country, is that we have elements of all three. When we started in Detroit way back a decade ago, we didn't have a single CDFI working in the city of Detroit. There was absolutely no community-based lending capacity. And so that was an example of where philanthropy and the federal government and the private sector had to partner up and figure out how to build the capacity to lend into community projects, whether it was small business or housing or any number of other things. Later on, we wanted to build out an early childhood development system. Well, turns out there are a lot of early childhood development professionals in the city of Detroit, but what they needed was greater coherence. They needed an ability to work across different types of childcare and early childhood development. And so there, the capacity that needed to be built was sort of more of a string it together capacity as opposed to create a new capacity. And then there are times when the capacity is there, it just needs some real bump up. And I think there, the best example was the city of Detroit's housing capacity. I mean, the city of Detroit took on the issue of removing blight and trying to replace the blight with sort of productive uses, but they alone simply couldn't do it. They needed Dan Gilbert at Quicken Loans, they needed Kresge, they needed JP Morgan Chase. They need a lot of actors to put both capital and absorptive capacity into place in order to move that housing system forward. So again, to go back to the term you mentioned earlier, the sort of ecology of capacity, you know, capacity exists in different doses in different places. And I think what a community needs is some mechanism by which there is an identification of where strategically the priorities need to lie and where that capital can be corralled. And sorry, I don't mean to go on, but that was essentially the task of Sean Donovan and HUD during the Obama administration. They had capital, they had talent, they had policy, but it sort of differentially landed, and they needed Sherpas at the local level to help them figure out how that would best be done.
Well, so I want to pick up on the Sherpa point before we sort of move on, which is just, I want to make sure we recognize when I've traveled the city of Detroit with you, many of the people I meet are not just at JP Morgan Chase or at the Skillman Foundation or others, but that there are NGOs that today exist in those communities that are leading the work in many places that you've described with the resources and support aligned in a strategy that in many cases was not designed in Washington or even in the offices of Kresge, but was designed in the neighborhoods. And talk about when we're talking here about mobilizing the federal government, when we're move to public safety in a minute, but these are analogies that I think are useful. We want to mobilize federal resources, but whose plan do they invest in? And if it is, how do we make sure that that plan is one that is authentic and is actually driven by knowledge and expertise that lives in community?
Yeah, that's exactly the right question and exactly the right point, because Detroit didn't come back, Memphis will not come back, New Orleans will not come back, Fresno will not come back from the precipice we find ourselves in. through that kind of parachute in process. And you're absolutely right. If philanthropy can provide some capital, the federal government can provide some policy, the city hall can provide some legitimacy, but ultimately, those with the deepest adjacency to the problems are the ones who obviously need to be enlisted in their solution. And just a couple of quick examples from Detroit, which I think are just illustrative. First is we didn't have a land use plan in 2010 in Detroit. We had no sort of sense of how to prioritize the rebuilding of neighborhoods. 100,000 vacant and abandoned properties. Where do you start? What's your fifth move? What's your 13th move? And so the community developed a very sophisticated 3-year-long process of organizing neighborhood after neighborhood after neighborhood to ask the question of what are your assets? What are your impediments? What kinds of resources do you need to kind of move beyond them? And then we were able to provide sort of at a mezzo level, some folks who could help stitch that together and sort of see the patterns across community. But at the end of the day, it was the community development impulses of that community, the community organizing impulses of that community that made that whole effort work. And you can repeat that in housing, you can repeat that in small business development, in early childhood development, and transportation. There's literally no system in which you don't have to sort of work deductively from the bottom up. And then I think it becomes a little bit the challenge for government to sort of make sure that there is coherence, that you're not sort of fragmenting a community into 15 different pieces, that these systems work together, but ultimately the energies have to boil up. And so at Kresge, we developed very early on a suite of programs that invested in community-based problem solving and capacity and implementation capacity. I mean, it's one thing to sort of identify the problem. It's another thing to sort of identify a bunch of solutions, but then ultimately these solutions have to be delivered to people where they live. And so I think the next generation of work is really how do we build the implementation capacity, the operationalization capacity of neighborhoods. And I think it's possible.
All right, so as a nice transition from the lessons of this conversation to the next topic around community safety, I want to ask you, setting aside your hopes and dreams for electoral outcomes, give us, assume we have a federal government that wants to be facilitative of whatever the particular visions are. Give us a big hope about the role that the federal government can play in the next chapter of rebuilding communities from the consequences of the pandemic in so many different dimensions right now. And one anxiety you have about thing we should be very cautious to make sure we avoid in the next chapter. You are now talking to the place-based cabinet of the next administration, whoever that may be. What is your charge to them, and what is your thing to take care to avoid?
Well, let me stay on theme and say I think that the single most important thing they can do is to recognize that the response at the local level absolutely has to be customized, that the plug and play model of federal intervention simply doesn't work. It's harder to customize, it takes more time, it takes a different kind of staff competence, it takes just a whole different mindset. But I think particularly given the energies of racial justice and reconciliation, there's going to be a whole new wave of community-based capacity that's going to need to be built, integrated, and move forward. And so if the federal government insists on behaving as if they are the sort of the parachuters in for these kinds of problem-solving challenges, I think they will really get tripped up. I think the good news is that everything we have seen out of at least one side of this electoral equation suggests that they've learned that lesson, that there are people who are likely to move into the next administration who are deeply committed to this kind of community-based capacity building approach. On the other side, I fear that this federal government, not whoever wins, if the Biden administration were to take over, it is going to have to plug so many holes, fill so many voids, pay attention to so many basic dysfunctional residue of what's come before that they won't have time to really customize the kind of work I've just described. And so I think it's just one more call to local communities to develop the very smartest sort of collective wisdom they can, and not wait for the federal government to come in and help turn the ship right.
Well, let's hope that we have support from the federal government, but local leadership. And I think that's a wonderful segue to this next topic. But it is really, you've described the themes that are embedded in each of the Opportunity for All essays that can be found on the Urban Institute website. Others about locally led efforts to support housing affordability, to support inclusion in opportunity-rich communities, and a whole host of other topics. So I encourage everyone to join in. Let me just say thank you to you, Rip, for being with us. And with that, welcome our next guest, Fernando Rejón, Executive Director of the Urban Peace Institute, and Urban Senior Fellow Jesse Jannetta. And each of them have together, the two of them together have authored a proposal that can be found, will be found on the website of this event at Urban, as well as on the Opportunity for All paper, and Opportunity for All page, if you will. And really excited to get to talk a little bit about the work that you're proposing should be on the agenda of the next administration, which I suspect, while in a different domain, will hit some of the same themes that last conversation just spoke to. So Fernando, I think I'm going to start with you and ask you to talk a little bit about the work of the Urban Peace Institute. You know, we're at a moment when sort of there's a huge national visibility in the wake of mass protests of George Floyd's killing. And actually most recently in response to the killing of Walter Wallace in Philadelphia, about an alternative way to make communities safe, to create places that are supportive and welcoming for all our citizens. And your organization has been very much at the heart of building some of these alternative models. So you could talk a little bit about what we mean when we say community-based safety efforts, and what might be some alternatives to the kind of policing that has been on the front pages of the paper.
Sure, thank you, Sarah, and pleasure to be here with everyone. So my name is Fernando Rejón. I'm the Executive Director of the Urban Peace Institute. Urban Peace Institute implements violence reduction strategies and smart justice solutions to end violence and mass incarceration so communities can thrive. So our work has taken us across the country, although we are located in Los Angeles, California. In Los Angeles, we've helped to really build a lot of the infrastructure around violence prevention, mainly through the development of gang intervention in the city of Los Angeles. So that work really relies on former gang members, formerly incarcerated individuals who have transformed their lives to become peacemakers to reduce violence. But along with that, also we do a lot of work around justice reform. And so, for example, in LA County, working to shrink the probation system and reallocate those dollars to build a community-based public safety and health infrastructure. So some of the context of this paper, some context for the paper is, while we were writing it, we were hit by the pandemic. Right? Then the calls for justice and uprisings. And so this essay became very timely, and not only did it really push us to push the thinking forward, but also, you know, our work at Urban Peace Institute was really thrust forward, and you know, we're getting a lot of calls, and people wanted to know, you know, what we think about defunding police? What did we think about violence reduction strategies? What did we think about unarmed, non-law enforcement approaches to safety? And again, I differentiate a bit public safety from community safety, because the traditional narrative of public safety has really been from above, right? And law enforcement, the whole law and order platform has really given law enforcement and the criminal justice system the main role in public safety. That is a narrative that we have to change. And when we talk about community safety, is what makes people in the communities feel safe. It's of course it's freedom from violence, but it's also access to health. It's also access to stable employment. It's also access to food. So we have to broaden the understanding of public safety. And for me, it's merging how community sees public safety, how they experience it, and merging it with a larger public safety agenda. And that's going to require a shift in values at the federal level. And a shift in values is indicated by a shift in dollars and investment in communities that have been isolated from these conversations. So communities don't necessarily want to be recipients of safety. They want to be partners in safety and have a very important role in determining and building an infrastructure so they can not only be safe, healthy, but they can also thrive.
So Jesse, you two together wrote a paper as part of this series that talks about sort of reorienting from a public safety strategy to a public health approach. Can you describe what the sort of core proposal is that's in this paper, and sort of why should we, sort of what's the case for making this shift from a more law enforcement approach to building safety?
Sure. I think a couple of things. I mean, one of the basic premises here is that there's an opportunity. We wanted to make the call for federal investment in these kind of community safety strategies, in part because the amount of innovation and proof of concept and demonstration of what this could look like that's come from communities and cities all over the country has really put us in a position where I think the case that there's really something here, there's an ability, you know, as Rip was saying, to customize it, because there's a lot of different forms that this has taken, but there's really a knowledge and practice base here. We're at that point. I think that we wanted to be very informed by the fact that traditional justice approaches, policing, but also courts, corrections, prosecution, even when they're effective at the sort of immediate crime control goals that they're aimed at, impose intense and unequal burden on communities, everything from police contact, which we know has very serious long-term consequences for youth, even if there's no arrest, police use of force, fines and fees, mass incarceration, the way that we've traditionally done a lot of public safety policy, as Fernando says, really, again, imposes tremendous burdens on communities. And so the idea is, in part, that this community safety approach can do as well or better and minimize those burdens. And I wanted to pick up on a word that Fernando used, which is infrastructure. What we're trying to lay out is a vision, and you know, many cities have a ways to go to get there, although some, like Los Angeles, have really built a lot of this, but to try and articulate what the community safety infrastructure might look like, what it takes to support these approaches at scale with consistent quality and in a way that they can be sustained over time. And as we were articulating that, one of the core ideas was the importance of thinking about investment needing to happen to coordinate work at three levels. The first being at the real grassroots with community-based organizations with strong ties and presence in neighborhoods, understanding of the dynamics there. In many places, these are the organizations that employ violence interrupters and outreach workers, the people going out and engaging in the relational work with communities every day to create safety. But a second key level, and this is a strong role that the Urban Peace Institute plays in LA, is of intermediary organizations, also community-based organizations, often a little larger, that have trusting relationships with the grassroots leadership of those community-based organizations, but can also help coordinate their work and collaboration, can provide assistance and enhance their capacity where they may need it, and also upward advocacy for system and practice changes that might be needed to align community safety strategies or municipal safety strategies with community priorities. They're kind of the keeper or have to attend to making sure that there's mission alignment and coordination at a citywide level about what you're trying to do with safety. And then finally, there's a key role for local government to make sure that they are connecting to the work that these community-led organizations are doing, the vision for safety that's coming out of the communities, but also that they're creating the structure to have that be part of a coherent safety strategy for the entirety of the city. And again, I think we took a lot of strength from the idea that this is already happening in cities across the United States, but the scale of resources devoted to it isn't equal to the promise it has, and it's certainly nowhere near the level of investment in traditional safety institutions like police departments. We have a long way to go to get there, but partly what that means is that the investment you can make in some of these activities, it's still in a real early growth stage in terms of what it's capable of doing, I think.
So I want to follow up on that last point together. In some ways, you've talked about infrastructure. The third part of that infrastructure is actually a role for the public sector, whether that governmental role is through the police department itself or through other arms of the local government. Just to put this in the larger context of the front page of the paper, so much of our debate right now is about whether we ought to reform practices or whether we ought to defund the police and do something instead with the resources. Is this some of both? Is this a clearly taking resources and to invest in community? Is it also a different way for the police to relate to safety in these places and to the institutions that could play some of this role? Fernando, what's your experience?
Yeah, I mean, my answer to that is, we talk about the Urban Peace Institute really changing the mission of American policing. And what does that mean? And bottom line is there's no more us versus them. And so when we look at if you look at the history of policing in the United States, you have to look at colonialism, you have to look at containment of slaves on the plantations, and you have to look at suppression of worker protests, suppression of protests. And so when we look at how the criminal justice system was built and the intention behind it, there's an ecosystem that was developed. And they were able to really gather a lot of strength and a lot of power through resources. Tough on crime laws, the war on gangs, and the war on drugs really helped to solidify that narrative and create an ecosystem that we know is unjust. And part of our role is to shrink the system and redirect those dollars to build an ecosystem that allows communities to thrive. That is not based on systemic racism, that actually changes the values of the country to say, you know what, we're gonna start investing in these communities different. We're gonna close the community to prison pipeline, and we are going to change the mission of American policing, and we're gonna allow and invest in opportunities for communities that have historically been oppressed by law enforcement or any of the other structures that are there to thrive. And a lot of it, for us, we look at a divest model. I think reforms are not enough at this point. There needs to be radical restructuring of what law enforcement is, but also part of that radical restructuring is reinvesting dollars to build a sustainable ecosystem. And really, when the calls from Black Lives Matter to reimagine public safety, it's really that call to say, look, we have to end the reliance on law enforcement, and for us, an over-reliance on law enforcement, and really start building new ideas of what safety means. And the federal government can have a huge role in that. I think a great example that we cite in the paper is, this is at the state level, the CalVIP coalition that exists in the state of California, which we're a part of, led by Giffords Law Center. But you have organizations up and down the state who do violence prevention work. We're advocating for $39 million to be redirected to the highest need communities where there's the most homicides, most shootings, in order to start building that capacity and start building an infrastructure for the state to invest in those dollars into these communities that have these historical disparities. And I think the pandemic and the calls for justice have really shined the light on this. I mean, we've known about it for years. We've been talking about it for as long as I've been in this line of work. And now it's critical at this time to really call out the historic injustices, the systemic injustices that we've been experiencing for so many decades, and start to say, look, if we're really going to change this country, if we're really going to change the mission of policing, if we're really going to create safety, we have to redefine it, but we have to shift power. And when you want to talk about addressing systemic racism, it's really a challenge to power. How do you shift power? How do you shift dollars to invest in people and say, look, everybody, you matter, these communities matter, our people matter, and we need to begin to change the way we see these communities, how we work, but also involve people in the communities. Again, people don't want to be recipients of it, they want to be partners in it. And to be true partners, you have to walk alongside with these communities to build the infrastructures that they need.
That's a perfect segue to a question we've gotten from the audience that let me ask you, Jesse, to try to elaborate on. What does it mean for a community to be defining its own strategies for safety? I think the question really goes to, who is the community who has a voice, and what's the mechanism by which we gain the benefit of their sort of knowledge, expertise of what would make their neighborhood safe. And then if you would, Jesse, while you talk about that, you've been studying these models in a number of places. And so what do we know about their effectiveness and relative effectiveness of having the community be part of shaping the strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the challenges here is you have to have a community engagement to some degree, an organizing strategy to do that work. A model that I think about a lot is the work of Neighborhood Stat in New York City that's operating right now in 15 communities. They're all public housing developments, and they've got a broad community engagement strategy with the residents of those developments to talk about what their community safety priorities are. And they've engaged a pretty wide array of city agencies, interestingly, not including NYPD, but a lot of other ones. And they've been doing sometimes it's installing lighting or a lot of things around physical design, but they've had a pretty robust community engagement process directly walking definition of problems into specific changes being made. Now, there is a benefit in doing that in terms of doing it in a public housing development, because you could think, okay, well then here the community is the residents of this development, and we know who they are, and we can define it in that way. And there is that work of trying to figure out exactly how you're going to define your geography and do that community engagement. But I think there are participatory democracy models that do that work. I think participatory budgeting is also in a slightly different area, a model for doing that. And I think, you're asking about evidence. I think we have a lot of evidence about, the effectiveness of, civilianized strategies like, public health approaches, violence interruption, cure violence, hospital-based violence intervention. We could use more, and that evidence base is increasing every day. But a lot of the questions that we're asking are around reducing community harm and shifting power. And I do think it's a real challenge for us in the research community. I think our program evaluation work has tended to focus on particular traditional safety outcomes, reducing violence, recidivism, and things like that. And to answer some of the broader questions and ambitions about whether these things work and what we're trying to do, we're going to have to push ourselves to think about what success means and what we're trying to understand much more broadly. Certainly opportunity for all is about whether we're increasing equality and access to opportunity in neighborhoods through doing these kind of approaches. And it's a real push for us to have a way that we're building the knowledge that actually answers those questions.
Yeah, no, a lot of our work, we've often talked about not only sort of an economic success, economic opportunity, but what is the dignity that comes from having power and autonomy over one's life, the ability to move through community with safety, and to have some sense that you can live in a community that can value everyone's contributions, and different models can clearly pursue those goals and objectives in different ways. So, Fernando, I'm going to ask you two questions, and we're going to run out of time, so I'm going to ask everybody to be brief on these. The first question is about how do you define community involvement just in your work? How is the community helping to shape the strategies? And then I'd like to ask you about why you think, is the feds just a pocketbook, or is there a role for the federal government to incentivize practices at the states? What is it that you're looking for from the federal government that could support your work in an increasing number of cities? 3 minutes or less.
So I think it's involving community is engagement, being willing to listen, but also it's about investment, investing dollars in the community. So, for example, if there are grants, if we have a training academy for gang intervention workers, and we pay all of our instructors, and they're partners in it. They're paid for their expertise, and I think building an infrastructure around that is critical and engaging. So not only listening, but also paying people for their time and providing contracts and resources that are going to that demonstrates value. Their expertise is valued, and they're part of the development of a system of care that's going to go beyond suppression. The piece about the federal government, again, going back to the shift in values. If the federal government says, look, we're going to shift $1 billion to address gun violence and the impacts in urban communities, that's a value shift. It sends a strong message across the country to states, to local municipalities, to national funders to say, this is the direction that we're going. So it's a huge value shift. But additionally, it's investment in building a scalable, building a scalable infrastructures that communities need. So a lot of times people say, look, we want to invest in these communities, but there's no capacity there. So I think that having federal investment really allows, or it really allows more for a long-term view of what it's going to take. Think about what it took to build a community, a criminal justice system, and how they took that to scale. Now you dismantle that, you shrink that, and now you're building a community system, a continuum of care that is going to require large amounts of money, long-term investment to scale it to where we can really change the dynamics in the country.
So I have two questions. I'm going to give you a chance each to decide in our 3 minutes left which one you want to answer. So one of the questions comes from the audience, and it's really about the role for reconciliation and particularly models about reparation or some other kind of investment that comes from historical racial injustices in particular communities. What role does that kind of reconciliation and acknowledgement process play in designing community strategies? That's one question. The second question is, we typically on these calls get a lot of people from government, community organizations, philanthropy, the private sector, so beyond the federal government. And so the question, this particularly for you, maybe Fernando, is what more can they do to help advance this kind of strategy? For so many, defund the police is the slogan, but they don't know what that means to do next. And so maybe Jesse, super quick, if you have thoughts on the role of reconciliation, and Fernando, what are you asking everybody else to do to support the agenda that you guys are advancing?
I mean, reconciliation is really big, but I think that the power sharing is a key part of that. And if you want to do reparative work, and we're coming through this period where the communities that have borne the brunt of a lot of the failures of American society are now having those harms even replicated. And part of what reparative work could look like is you put more resources directly into the control of communities to set their own agenda. This is something that's come up prior to COVID a lot in conversations about cannabis legalization, and shouldn't there be some of the revenues for that? You can identify which communities bore the brunt of cannabis enforcement when it was illegal, and could you just give them some of those resources and put it in their power? And I think that that's a real part of if we want to get to real reconciliation, reparation.
That's great. Thank you. Fernando, close us out.
Thank you. So regarding philanthropy is that, public dollars is we're going to take these strategies to scale. Private dollars are what's really going to help with the innovation and to build and to really start to innovate and build new systems that are going to allow people to try new things. And I think that a lot of times, for example, we have community-based organizations that are organized and saying, this is the type of safety we want. And then we have elected officials that are saying, okay, we have to try to find funds for it. And a lot of times bureaucracies don't look at long-term plans. But when you have philanthropy saying, hey, look, we're willing to put up this amount of money, we need the public sector to match it, or you have philanthropy saying, hey, look, we're in and we support this, they can help really support the political will, the alignment of political will that it's going to take to generate funds and to pull funds together in the city to begin implementing these strategies. And so there's a political role for philanthropy, but also an investment role in really investing in innovative strategies. And I think public-private partnerships are going to be important moving forward. So not only the public dollars for the core system structure, but also the private dollars to support innovation and try new things, pilot new strategies. They're going to push the field forward and going to push the idea of community safety and health forward into the future.
Well, that's a perfect place to end. Fernando, thank you both for your work. Really important, innovative stuff here, and really great for us to be able to learn from you. Thank you, Jesse, and to both of you for putting this paper together and putting these ideas that I hope will be considered not only by whoever leads the federal government in the future and their teams, but also by philanthropy. And Rip, thank you for being with us. Really great to have you here and to set the context for the themes for the whole series. Take a look at urbaninstitute.org, Opportunity for All. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at another one of these events soon. Be well and vote.
All right. Thank you.